The proving grounds outside Fort Knox, Kentucky, fall silent on a morning in September 1945. Engineers and ordnance officers stand in clusters, watching as a mechanical behemoth emerges from the testing facility. 70 tons of American steel, wider than any tank ever built, moving at the speed of a man's leisurely walk. The T-28 Super Heavy tank, designed to break through Germany's Siegfried Line, finally exists in physical form. But Germany surrendered 4 months ago. The war is over. And this enormous machine, born from fear of German engineering superiority, represents one of the most profound ironies of American armor development. In their panic to copy the enemy, they built exactly the wrong weapon. This is the story of how America, the nation that won the tank war through mass production and mobility, temporarily lost its way and tried to out-German the Germans, and what that panic revealed about the nature of armored warfare itself. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The fear began in North Africa, but it crystallized in Normandy. On the morning of June 13, 1944, near Villers-Bocage in the French countryside, a single German Tiger tank, commanded by SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, encountered elements of the British 7th Armoured Division. What followed became a nightmare that American tankers would hear about for months. Wittmann's Tiger destroyed approximately 14 tanks and 15 personnel carriers in 15 minutes. The numbers vary depending on the source, but the terror was universal and absolute. American tank crews had already encountered the Tiger in Tunisia and Italy, but Villers-Bocage demonstrated something visceral about the psychological impact of German heavy armor. The standard American M4 Sherman tank, the backbone of Allied armored forces, mounted a 75mm gun that could barely scratch a Tiger's frontal armor at combat ranges. The Tiger's 88mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor from nearly 2,000 yards away. American tankers developed a grim rule of thumb. It took 5 Shermans to destroy 1 Tiger, and 4 of those Shermans wouldn't survive the encounter. The problem wasn't ignorance. American ordnance officers knew exactly what they were up against. Intelligence reports from Tunisia in 1943 had provided detailed specifications of the Tiger I, 54 tons of weight, armor up to 100mm thick on the front, capable of defeating any Allied tank in service. The Tiger II, entering service in 1944, was even more formidable, 69 tons, with frontal armor reaching 150mm. These weren't just tanks, they were mobile fortresses. But understanding the problem and solving it were different matters entirely. The American response evolved through several phases, each revealing different assumptions about what tanks were actually for. The first response was practical. Upgrade the Sherman. The M4A3E8 Sherman, known as the Easy 8, received improved suspension and a higher velocity 76mm gun. It helped, but it wasn't enough. The gun could penetrate a Tiger's side armor under ideal conditions, but head-to-head encounters remained suicidal. The second response was the M26 Pershing, a 46-ton heavy tank mounting a 90mm gun. Development began in 1942, but production delays and doctrinal disputes meant only 20 Pershings reached Europe before the war ended. The Pershing represented a compromise heavier than a Sherman, but still mobile enough for pursuit operations. It could fight a Tiger on roughly equal terms, trading mobility for improved armor and firepower. But for a group of engineers and officers within Army Ordnance, these solutions missed the point. If Germany could build 70-ton monsters, America needed to build something bigger. Something that could smash through any fortification, defeat any tank, win through sheer overwhelming force. The psychological wound of Tiger superiority demanded not just parity, but dominance. The concept emerged from a specific tactical problem: the Siegfried Line. Formerly known as the West Wall, this defensive network stretched for nearly 400 miles along Germany's western border, featuring thousands of bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and fortified positions. Intelligence estimates suggested that breaking through would require specialized assault vehicles capable of surviving concentrated anti-tank fire while reducing fortifications. The British had their Churchill tanks and specialized armor. The Soviets were developing heavy breakthrough tanks. America, the thinking went, needed its own. In May 1944, the Ordnance Department issued specifications for what would become the T-28 Super Heavy tank. The requirements revealed a fundamental shift in thinking about armored warfare. Maximum armor. Sufficient to resist the German 88mm anti-tank gun at point-blank range. Minimum armament. A 105mm gun capable of destroying fortifications. Speed. Not mentioned as a priority. The emphasis was entirely on survivability and firepower, with mobility considered acceptable as a sacrifice. The Pacific Car and Foundry Company received the contract, and engineers began designing something unprecedented in American armor development. The T-28 would weigh 95 tons when fully equipped, making it the heaviest armored vehicle America had ever attempted to build. The armor reached astonishing thickness, 305 millimeters on the front of the superstructure, 12 inches of cast steel designed to laugh at German anti-tank weapons. The 105mm T5E1 gun could fire a 40-pound armor-piercing projectile capable of penetrating any known German fortification. But mass creates problems that firepower cannot solve. At 95 tons, the T-28 exceeded the weight capacity of virtually every bridge in Europe. American engineers developed a solution that was ingenious and telling. The outer tracks could be removed for transport, reducing the width from 14 feet 11 inches to 10 feet 10 inches, and the weight to approximately 86 tons. Even this reduced configuration exceeded most bridge limits, but at least it could theoretically be transported by rail. The speed told the real story. Maximum velocity on roads, 8 miles per hour. Cross-country speed, perhaps 4 miles per hour under ideal conditions. The Ford GAF 5-8 engine, the same power plant used in the Sherman, struggled to move nearly 3 times the weight. The T-28 wasn't built for maneuver warfare or pursuit operations. It was built to lumber toward fixed fortifications, absorb punishment, and methodically destroy obstacles. It represented the complete opposite of American armor philosophy. Because American armor philosophy, despite the panic over Tigers, had actually been remarkably successful. General George S. Patton's Third Army demonstrated the real American advantage during the summer of 1944. Between August 1st and September 1st, Patton's forces advanced nearly 600 miles, from Avranches to the Moselle River, liberating vast swaths of France through speed and operational mobility. They didn't do this by fighting Tigers tank to tank. They did it by going around them, cutting supply lines, forcing German armor to retreat or be encircled. The Sherman, despite its inferiority in one-on-one combat, possessed advantages that mattered more in actual operations. It was reliable, mechanical breakdown rates were significantly lower than German heavy tanks. It was produced in enormous numbers. Nearly 50,000 Shermans were built during the war, compared to approximately 1,300 Tigers of all variants. When a Sherman broke down, spare parts arrived within days. When a Tiger broke down in France, parts might come from Germany, if they came at all. The logistical reality was even more telling. A Sherman weighed approximately 33 tons and consumed roughly 130 gallons of fuel per 100 miles. The Tiger I weighed 54 tons and consumed 270 gallons per 100 miles under ideal conditions, far more in combat. The T-28, at 95 tons, would have required fuel delivery on a scale that made operational maneuver essentially impossible. But in 1944, these statistical realities competed with visceral fear. Tankers who had watched their squad mates burn inside Shermans didn't care about production numbers or fuel consumption rates. They wanted armor that could stop an 88mm shell. They wanted guns that could kill Tigers from the front. The T-28 promised to deliver both, and the Ordnance Department pushed the program forward. By late 1944, the tactical situation on the Western Front had evolved in ways that made the T-28's mission questionable. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive, demonstrated that German armour remained dangerous, but was increasingly hamstrung by fuel shortages and lack of air cover. American tank destroyers, particularly the M36 Jackson with its 90mm gun, proved capable of handling German heavy tanks when properly deployed. The Siegfried Line was being reduced through combined arms operations, artillery, infantry, and conventional armour working together. Yet the T-28 program continued. 5 prototypes were authorized, though only 2 would actually be completed. Engineers worked through complex technical challenges. The transmission system, the suspension capable of handling such extreme weight, the gun mount that could accommodate the massive 105mm weapon. Each solution added complexity, and complexity added time. The first prototype wasn't completed until April 1945. By then, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine, and the Siegfried Line existed only in rear areas. The tactical justification for the T-28 had evaporated before the vehicle could even begin testing, but the program had developed its own momentum, driven by institutional investment and the persistent belief that America needed an answer to German heavy armour. Testing at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland revealed exactly what physics predicted. The T-28 was monumentally well-armoured and powerfully armed, but it was also achingly slow and mechanically stressed. The suspension system struggled with the weight. The engine ran hot. The crew of 4 operated in cramped conditions, and the vehicle's battlefield endurance was measured in hours of operation before maintenance became necessary. The designation itself revealed uncertainty about what the vehicle actually was. Initially called the T-28 Super Heavy Tank, it was later redesignated the T-95 gun motor carriage, reflecting confusion about whether it was a tank or a self-propelled gun. Eventually, it returned to the T-28 designation, but the bureaucratic back and forth indicated deeper uncertainty about the vehicle's purpose and role. By September 1945, when that prototype emerged at Fort Knox, the war in Europe had been over for 4 months. Japan had surrendered 3 weeks earlier. The T-28 existed in a world where its enemies were defeated and its mission was obsolete. Engineers continued testing because the program existed, because budgets had been allocated, because institutional momentum carries projects beyond their rational endpoints. The parallel program, the T-29 heavy tank, told a similar story with slightly different details. The T-29 represented an attempt to build an American heavy tank that could match German designs while retaining some operational mobility. At 64 tons, it was lighter than the T-28, but still far heavier than the Pershing. It mounted a 105mm gun in a fully traversing turret, making it more flexible than the T-28's fixed superstructure. 8 T-29 prototypes were built, and testing revealed a capable vehicle better armoured and more powerfully armed than anything previously produced in America. But it also revealed the same fundamental problems: complexity, mechanical stress, logistical burden. The T-29 could fight, but it couldn't be easily transported, couldn't operate far from supply depots, couldn't be produced in the numbers that American industrial warfare required. The T-30 followed, mounting a 155mm gun, the largest weapon ever fitted to an American tank. 4 prototypes were built. Testing showed the gun could destroy absolutely anything, but the vehicle was even more ponderous and even less practical than the T-29. The programs multiplied, each seeking some combination of firepower and armor that could dominate the battlefield, each running into the same wall of physics and logistics. The irony deepened when American intelligence officers finally gained access to German tank production facilities and strategic planning documents in the months following victory in Europe. What they discovered challenged every assumption that had driven the super-heavy tank programs. German heavy tank production had been a strategic disaster disguised as a technological triumph. The Tiger I program, from 1942 through August 1944, produced exactly 1,347 vehicles. During the same period, Germany manufactured approximately 8,900 Panzer IV medium tanks, their closest equivalent to the Sherman. The Tiger II, entering service in 1944, achieved even more dismal production numbers. Only 492 were ever built. But the numbers themselves didn't tell the complete story. American analysts examining German factory records discovered something more revealing: manufacturing time. A single Tiger I required approximately 300,000 man-hours to produce. A Panzer IV required just 115,000 man-hours. The Tiger was consuming nearly 3 times the industrial capacity for a vehicle that couldn't be deployed in corresponding numbers. The maintenance records were even more damning. German logistics officers had documented the nightmare of supporting Tigers in combat. The Maybach HL 230 engine, producing 700 horsepower to move 54 tons, suffered from chronic overheating and mechanical failures. Average operational life before major repair: approximately 500 miles under ideal conditions. In combat conditions, with the stress of tactical movement and engagement, that figure dropped significantly. German tank commanders reported that on any given day during the Normandy campaign, approximately 30 to 40% of their Tigers were non-operational due to mechanical issues. Some battalions reported 50% breakdown rates. The Tiger's Achilles heel wasn't its armor or its gun, it was the transmission, the engine, the suspension components stressed beyond their design limits by the vehicle's enormous weight. The fuel consumption created operational paralysis. A Tiger the 1st Battalion at full-strength 45 tanks required approximately 12,000 gallons of fuel per 100 miles of movement. By late 1944, German fuel production had collapsed under Allied bombing, and synthetic fuel plants were producing barely enough to keep the Luftwaffe operational. Tiger battalions spent weeks immobilized, waiting for fuel that never came in sufficient quantities. When the fuel arrived, it was often of such poor quality that it caused additional engine problems. American analysts discovered planning documents from Albert Speer's armaments ministry that revealed the internal German debate about heavy tank production. Several senior officers and production managers had argued against the Tiger program, pointing out that the same industrial capacity could produce 3 Panzer IVs or 4 Stug 3 assault guns for every Tiger. They were overruled by Hitler's personal fascination with superweapons and the psychological impact of invulnerable armor. The post-war interrogations of German tank commanders provided even more pointed testimony. SS Obersturmführer Otto Carius, one of the most successful Tiger commanders, acknowledged that while the Tiger was formidable in defensive operations, it was nearly useless in the mobile warfare that characterized the Eastern Front after 1943. "We couldn't pursue," he explained in debriefing sessions. "By the time we reached the battlefield, the situation had changed. By the time we needed to reposition, we had no fuel." This was the context American officers absorbed in late 1945 and early 1946 as they evaluated their own super-heavy tank programs. The Germans had walked down the path of heavier armor and bigger guns, and it had led to strategic defeat. Germany had lost the tank war, not because their individual vehicles were inferior, they were often superior, but because they had built the wrong tanks for the wrong kind of war. The realization crystallized during a series of meetings at the Army Ordnance Department in the spring of 1946. Senior officers reviewing the T-28, T-29, and T-30 programs confronted an uncomfortable question. Had America just spent millions of dollars and countless engineering hours copying German mistakes? General Jacob Devers, who had commanded the 6th Army Group in Europe, provided blunt testimony. American success in Europe, he argued, had come from operational mobility and overwhelming numbers. Patton's Third Army hadn't defeated German armor by fighting it tank to tank. They had defeated it by moving faster than German logistics could respond, by cutting supply lines, by forcing German heavy tanks to retreat or be abandoned for lack of fuel. The statistical analysis supported this view. American tank losses in Europe were indeed heavy. Approximately 4,000 Shermans were knocked out or destroyed between D-Day and victory in Europe. But Sherman production was so vast that losses were replaced within weeks. American armored divisions never lacked vehicles. German heavy tank battalions, by contrast, often operated at half strength or less because destroyed vehicles couldn't be replaced. The Schlacht um die Ardennen, the Battle of the Bulge, provided the clearest case study. German forces committed approximately 600 tanks, including significant numbers of Panthers and Tigers, in their last major offensive. The initial attack achieved tactical surprise and local superiority, but within 2 weeks, German armoured spearheads had ground to a halt, not primarily because of combat losses, but because they had outrun their fuel supplies. American forces counterattacked with roughly equal numbers of tanks, but with unlimited fuel, air support, and the ability to replace losses from the steady stream of replacement vehicles arriving from the United States. Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite armoured formations, entered the Bulge with approximately 60 tanks. By early January 1945, they had fewer than 20 operational vehicles. Most weren't destroyed in combat, they were abandoned when fuel ran out or when mechanical failures made them immobile. American tank recovery teams found dozens of German armoured vehicles abandoned intact along the roads of the Ardennes, left behind because there was no way to move them and no fuel to make them operational. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The American super heavy tank programs had been built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what won armoured warfare. They assumed that individual vehicle superiority mattered most. They assumed that thicker armour and bigger guns would translate to battlefield dominance. They had watched German Tigers destroy Shermans and concluded that America needed Tigers of its own. But the war had proven something different. Sustainability mattered more than invulnerability. Operational range mattered more than maximum armour. The ability to transport vehicles rapidly mattered more than absolute firepower. These weren't comfortable lessons for engineers who had just spent 3 years designing the most heavily armoured, most powerfully armed tanks America had ever produced. The T-28 testing program continued through 1947, not because anyone believed the vehicle had a future, but because institutional momentum and congressional funding required completion of the contracted work. Engineers documented everything: the maximum armour penetration of the 105mm gun, the cross-country performance under various terrain conditions, the mechanical reliability across hundreds of test miles. The results confirmed what battlefield analysis had already suggested. The T-28 could indeed resist any known anti-tank weapon. Its armour was functionally impenetrable to anything in the immediate post-war arsenal. The gun could destroy any fortification or vehicle at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. In a static, defensive engagement, it was nearly invincible. But modern warfare wasn't static. The mobility trials revealed the fatal flaw. The T-28 couldn't keep up with infantry, couldn't exploit breakthroughs, couldn't reposition rapidly enough to respond to fluid tactical situations. Its operational radius was measured in dozens of miles before refueling became necessary. The complex drivetrain required maintenance after relatively short periods of operation. It was a magnificent solution to a problem that no longer existed if it had ever existed in the form imagined. The bridge trials were particularly revealing. Engineers tested the T-28's ability to cross standard military bridges and found that almost none could support its weight, even with the outer tracks removed. Specialized bridging equipment would be required for any operation involving water crossings. This meant additional vehicles, additional logistics, additional complexity. In an actual campaign, the T-28 would have required an entire support infrastructure dedicated solely to keeping it mobile. The T-29 and T-30 programs underwent similar evaluations. Both vehicles were technically impressive, demonstrating that American industry could absolutely match German heavy tank design if required. But the strategic question remained, why would you want to? The war had been won with Shermans and logistics and industrial capacity, not with individual vehicle superiority. By 1948, the institutional consensus had formed. The future of American armour wouldn't involve 70-ton breakthrough tanks or 90-ton mobile fortresses. It would involve medium tanks that could be transported easily, maintained in the field, and produced in numbers that overwhelmed any enemy's ability to achieve local superiority. The T-28 program was officially terminated. The T-29 and T-30 programs were concluded without any vehicles entering production. One T-28 prototype was retained at Aberdeen Proving Ground for continued testing and display. The second prototype was sent to Fort Knox for evaluation and training purposes. The various T-29 and T-30 prototypes were distributed among ordnance facilities and eventually museums. They became monuments to a strategic path not taken, physical reminders of the moment when American armor development nearly copied German mistakes. The fate of the Fort Knox T-28 became its own small irony. Sometime in the 1950s, the vehicle was simply lost, misplaced somewhere on the vast Fort Knox reservation. An 86-ton tank disappeared, hidden perhaps in some storage building or test area, forgotten as newer programs and newer priorities occupied attention. It wasn't rediscovered until 1974, when a landscape crew stumbled across it in an overgrown field. Even abandonment required scale. But the real legacy of the super-heavy tank programs appeared in the vehicles America actually built for the Cold War. The M48 Patton tank, entering service in 1952, weighed 49 tons heavier than a Sherman, lighter than a Pershing, far lighter than any of the super-heavy prototypes. It mounted a 90mm gun, later upgraded to 105mm, providing sufficient firepower without the mechanical stress of the larger weapons. The M60, introduced in 1960, weighed 54 tons and mounted the British 105mm gun. It was exactly the Tiger's weight, but with vastly better mobility, reliability, and operational range. The M60 could cruise at 30 miles per hour on roads nearly 4 times the T-28's maximum speed. Its operational range exceeded 300 miles, compared to the T-28's estimated 100 miles under ideal conditions. The design philosophy had fundamentally shifted. American armor development abandoned the pursuit of invulnerability in favor of balanced capabilities. Sufficient armor for survivability, sufficient firepower for effectiveness, sufficient mobility for operational flexibility. The lessons learned weren't about metallurgy or gun ballistics. They were about what actually wins wars. The Soviet experience provided parallel confirmation. Soviet heavy tank development during the war had produced the IS-2, a 46-ton vehicle mounting a 122mm gun. After the war, Soviet designers experimented with even heavier vehicles, including the IS-7 at 68 tons. But by the early 1950s, Soviet doctrine had shifted toward medium tanks, recognizing the same constraints that American planners had identified: sustainability, transportability, operational flexibility. The German experience became a cautionary tale taught at armor schools. The Tiger battalions were studied not as models to emulate, but as examples of misallocated resources. Students learned that German industry had consumed the resources for 3 Panzer IVs to build each Tiger, and that trade-off had been strategically catastrophic. They learned that mechanical complexity and weight were vulnerabilities, just as surely as thin armor was a vulnerability. The psychological dimension remained complex. Veterans who had faced Tigers never forgot the terror of fighting them. The Sherman crews who had watched 88mm rounds punch through frontal armor carried those memories for life. The fear had been real, the casualties had been real, and the desire for better protection had been entirely rational from their perspective. But individual experience and strategic necessity sometimes diverge. What worked for survival in a single engagement might not work for winning campaigns. What felt necessary in the moment might not align with what the data later revealed. The veterans were right to fear the Tiger. The engineers were right to seek solutions. But the solution wasn't to build American Tigers, it was to build more Shermans, better logistics, overwhelming air support, and operational doctrine that avoided fighting Tigers on their terms. The abandoned T-28 prototype, sitting in that Fort Knox field through the 1960s and early 70s, became an unintentional monument to this truth. 95 tons of American steel, designed to smash through fortifications that had already fallen, armed to destroy tanks that had already been defeated, built to win a war that was already over. It represented fear translated into metal, panic transformed into engineering specifications, the conviction that matching the enemy's strengths was more important than exploiting their weaknesses. When that prototype was rediscovered in 1974, armor development had moved on entirely. The M1 Abrams was in early development, representing everything the T-28 was not: gas turbine powered for high speed, composite armor for efficient protection, designed for rapid deployment and sustained operations. The Abrams would weigh 60 tons when it entered service in 1980, but it would be capable of 45 miles per hour and have an operational range of 300 miles. The technical specifications revealed how far the philosophy had evolved. The Abrams mounted a 105mm gun, later upgraded to 120mm, comparable to the T-28's armament. But where the T-28 achieved protection through mass 12 inches of solid steel, the Abrams used composite armor that provided better protection at lower weight. Where the T-28 struggled to reach 8 miles per hour, the Abrams could sustain tactical speeds that made it nearly impossible to target effectively. The engineers who designed the Abrams had studied the T-28 programs, not as blueprints to follow but as warnings to heed. They had absorbed the lesson that the tank war wasn't won by the heaviest armor or the biggest gun. It was won by the combination of protection, firepower, and mobility that allowed operational success. The T-28 had maximized the first two at the complete expense of the third, and that trade-off had been fundamentally wrong. Museum visitors today can see the surviving T-28 at Fort Benning, Georgia, now the National Armor and Cavalry Museum. It sits among the evolution of American armor, the M4 Sherman that actually won the war, the M26 Pershing that represented the balanced compromise, the later vehicles that incorporated lessons learned. The T-28 stands out dramatically larger, more heavily armored, seemingly more powerful than everything around it. But context reveals its true significance. The placard doesn't celebrate the T-28 as a triumph of American engineering. It presents the vehicle as an experiment, a path explored and ultimately rejected. The story it tells is about the moment America almost copied German strategic mistakes, about how fear of enemy superiority nearly led to abandoning the principles that had actually delivered victory. The numbers tell their own story. America produced roughly 49,234 Sherman tanks during World War II. These vehicles equipped not just American forces, but British, Soviet, and Free French armies. They fought in North Africa, Italy, France, Germany, and the Pacific. They weren't invulnerable, but they were present in overwhelming numbers, supported by logistics chains that kept them operational, sustained by industrial production that replaced losses faster than they could be inflicted. Germany produced 1,347 Tiger I tanks and 492 Tiger II tanks. These vehicles achieved remarkable kill ratios in favorable circumstances, created psychological terror among Allied tankers, and demonstrated that German engineering could produce technically superior machines. But they didn't win the war. They couldn't be produced in sufficient numbers, couldn't be supported in sustained operations, couldn't overcome the strategic disadvantages that their very existence represented. The T-28 program cost approximately $6 million in 1940s, funding roughly $90 million in today's money, for two prototypes that never fired a shot in anger. That same funding could have produced approximately 500 additional Sherman tanks, each of which would have been immediately useful, fully supportable, and tactically deployable. The cost-benefit analysis was brutal in its clarity. The human element remained embedded in these decisions. Young American tankers in France and Germany had desperately wanted better protection. They had watched their friends burn in knocked-out Shermans and reasonably concluded that thicker armor would save lives. Letters home from the front frequently mentioned the Tiger threat, the inadequacy of American armor, the frustration of fighting with inferior equipment. But those letters couldn't incorporate the strategic view. They couldn't know that American armor doctrine was fundamentally sound, that the Sherman's weaknesses in individual combat were offset by overwhelming advantages in production, logistics, and operational employment. They couldn't see that the real answer to the Tiger wasn't a better tank, but better tactics, using American advantages in mobility and numbers to avoid fighting on German terms. The generals and planners who had access to the broader picture faced different pressures. They heard the complaints from frontline troops. They saw the casualty reports. They felt the political pressure to demonstrate that American industry could match anything the enemy produced. The T-28 program emerged from these pressures, a physical manifestation of the need to be seen doing something about German heavy armor, even if the something wasn't strategically optimal. This tension between tactical necessity and strategic wisdom appears throughout military history, but rarely so clearly as in the super-heavy tank programs. Every specification in the T-28 design made sense from a certain perspective. Of course, you wanted armor thick enough to stop an 88mm gun. Of course, you wanted a weapon powerful enough to destroy fortifications. Of course, you wanted your crews protected against the most dangerous enemy weapons. But, of course, assumed that individual vehicle superiority mattered most. It assumed that the nature of armored combat favored the better protected, more heavily armed vehicle. It assumed that winning tank versus tank duels was the path to winning the tank war. Every one of these assumptions was wrong, or at least incomplete. The tank war was won by logistics, by industrial capacity, by operational doctrine that avoided the enemy's strengths while exploiting their weaknesses. The final irony appeared in the post-war equipment surveys conducted across Europe. American recovery teams documented thousands of abandoned German armored vehicles, Tigers, Panthers, assault guns left behind not because they were destroyed in combat, but because they ran out of fuel, broke down, or became impossible to move when German logistics collapsed. The Wehrmacht's emphasis on sophisticated, powerful vehicles had created a force that was unsustainable in extended operations. American vehicles, by contrast, were frequently found still operational in the locations where they'd been knocked out. The mechanical reliability and parts availability meant that even damaged Shermans could often be recovered and repaired. The infrastructure existed to support sustained operations. The industrial base could replace losses. The very characteristics that made individual Shermans vulnerable in combat, their relative simplicity, their standardized parts, their design for mass production, were the characteristics that made American armor successful strategically. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.